When we think of negotiation, we often think of a conflict, going head to head in a battle with someone else to protect our own interests against demands from themselves, which would serve them well, but wouldn't be in our interests. In short, we tend to assume that very often we have mutually conflicting interests, and therefore it's a zero-sum game, and we have to fight hard to try and protect our own interests at the expense of the others. But in reality, a large proportion of negotiations out there have very significant win-win potential, win-win component. Every time there is a buyer, there is a seller. Clearly, the buyer favors the good, sees greater value in the particular good rather than the money they're holding, and the seller the other way around. They would prefer to let go of the asset in return for the money that the buyer is going to offer them. So effectively, every transaction has a very strong set of underlying complementary interests. Now, of course, both parties want to keep as much money in their pocket as they possibly can, so there's always going to be a distributive component here, but we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which so many negotiations in business have fundamentally integrative characteristics. That is to say that you're creating value by bringing two parties together to find complementary interests. So we can think of integrative deals here as growing the pie, and then the distributive component is sharing the pie. Needless to say, most negotiations have some elements of both. So how do you do well in negotiation? Going into a negotiation, well, obviously, preparation, like anything, okay? Be prepared, the old Boy Scouts motto, for example. Anyway, taking the time, devoting time to looking for points of common interest prior to the negotiation is a critical component. Find out everything you can about the other party's interests. A lot of people know to do their homework about themselves. What do they want to get out of a deal? That's the more obvious element of preparing for negotiations. But in many circumstances, you're not going to get a deal at all out of the negotiation process unless you're actually working just as hard to solve the other side's problem. Because otherwise, they will have alternatives, and there's a very good chance they'll walk away and you won't get what you want. So you can, of course, go through a process of discovery of your own and their interests through the dialogue that arises in a negotiation situation, and there is an inevitable element of mutual discovery, particularly in complex set of negotiations and imperfect information. But there's a lot you can do in advance to try and understand the other person's or the other side's situation, to try and anticipate possible ways of finding complementary value creation. Value that will accrue to both of you, and therefore will be an incentive for the two of you, the two parties, to reach settlement. So effectively, you want to be able to consider a wide range of options and outcomes. Think in terms of a spectrum of possibilities rather than a simple position. A lot of people going into a negotiation define their bottom line, that and they often define it in terms of a single thing, such as price, for example. But indeed, the price itself is fundamentally a function of what you're getting. And if you're getting more than you anticipate through this process of finding complementarities, of creating value, then a bottom line approach, which just had a minimum price or a maximum price, for example, obviously a maximum price if you're on the buyer side, a minimum price if you're on the selling side, then you will be very unlikely to agree to a deal that actually would be in your interests. So think in terms of a spectrum of possibilities. Plan your objectives around ranges, upper and lower points, rather than a single fixed point. And also bargain across a set of issues rather than one issue at a time, because so many of the trade-offs are across issues. And if you start with dealing with issue 1 and then issue 2 and issue 3 and issue 4, effectively what you're doing is turning every single sub-issue in a negotiation into a distributive dynamic, which is a competitive dynamic rather than a value-creating, positive seeking mutual gain dynamic that you get with integrative bargaining. So bargaining across a set of issues rather than one issue at a time is a far better way to maintain a positive negotiation dynamic. So, of course, the notion of preparation there and knowing about the other party's circumstances clearly suggests that information is going to be your best weapon. And as I just said, the process of negotiation itself is an important mechanism of information discovery. Okay? So when you're actually communicating with the other party in a negotiation, you have to be alert to how your communication style may diminish the sharing of information, or it may actually elicit, encourage the other party to share more about their circumstances so that you can find common areas that you can actually build an integrative deal off. So, how do you actually get more information out of the other party? Well, ask lots of short questions. Don't give people a speech. Short questions, open questions. Open questions that allow them to speak expansively, that are not predicated on your assumptions or your conclusions about what their motivations might be. Okay? And questions that effectively just give them a yes or no are not going to be very helpful in terms of advancing quickly, efficiently, mutual understanding of your potential complementary interests. Now, if you have very different opinions on perceptions on some aspect of negotiations, don't worry too much about negotiating those different perceptions. Identify them and say, okay, well, we seem to have a different take on that, but that's okay. Let's move on and just move past it. In the process, the other party may actually revise their perception if they come round to realizing that you're speaking in good faith, that you're being honest with them, that your own perspective makes sense. And even if not, different perspectives on the same issue doesn't necessarily mean that you can't come to a mutually satisfying compromise in the end. So offer proposals that elicit information via responses. Just simply respectfully make a proposition and be very open to their qualified response and draw them out on why they might not like to do something, for example. So much conflict in life, and particularly in negotiation situations, comes about because people arrive in a negotiation situation with initial assumptions, and they are assumptions of distrust, for example, assumptions that the other party is not sincerely motivated to do a deal. Can be a whole range of perceptions, but all of these perceptions may contribute to a perceptual trap, that you end up in a downward spiral of conflict, for example. One of the most common perceptual traps that people fall into, and arguably this is part and parcel of human evolution. When resources were scarce and there was always a danger that people would be trying to take advantage of you, that we often see things in terms of zero-sum games. We don't see it as a pie that can be grown. We tend to see things in terms of a fixed pie, and as a consequence, people play distributive rather than integrative games. And some signs that people are in this mindset are things like a high level of defensiveness, that they expect that anything they would concede might weaken their position and that you might gain at their expense. So if you sense defensiveness from the other party, and that can take the form, for example, of being very resistant to any kind of overtures to share information. It can take the form of not being forthright or outgoing in terms of making propositions or counter propositions to keep a positive dynamic going. If you sense that, then you may have a bit of a problem there, in that the other party is locked in a zero-sum game mindset. And that doesn't mean you necessarily walk away. You just have to be somewhat patient in terms of turning people's perceptions around to try and emphasize the win-win. Okay? We do know that a lot of people have an excessive tendency to perceive that a gain by one person must be at another person's expense. Arguably, a lot of people who've studied politics rather than business tend to be focused on the competitive nature of things, for example. They tend to see scarce resources and political processes that divide up those resources based on relative strength, based on relative power. Business scholars, on the other hand, focused on markets, tend to be more focused on the win-win dynamics and have very much a growth orientation. Sometimes economics and business are criticized for supposedly being locked into a model of perpetual growth, and particularly people who are concerned about environmental sustainability often fall into this kind of criticism. We forget the positive side of this, though, that if your perspective is one of a growth orientation, you expect the economy to be bigger next year than it is today, that the business to have grown bigger than it was last year and is now, then that by definition is predicated on the assumption that there's a whole lot of people out there with complementary interests, people prepared to give money to the firm in return for what the firm does, for example. Okay, so this positive growth orientation means that very often you can engage people in an integrative bargaining dynamic. Okay. Now, in terms of severe perceptual or conflict traps, historically when resources were limited, then sometimes societies would fall into this. This is one of the ugly dynamics we find with shrinking economies. This is a real problem in unstable societies with very poor economic outlook. There really becomes a battle, a distributive battle for shrinking pool of resources. That's why companies in decline are not a nice place to work. For example, everyone's worried about whether they're going to be the person fired or the person next to them hopefully be the one who will be fired before they are, okay? Or one person's bonus might be another person's salary cut, for example. When you're in a growing dynamic, people can afford to be more generous to each other, can be more optimistic, can be more cooperative. Now, historically, when resources were scarce, conflict was rife. And of course, the early images in the slides here showed lots of weapons. By the way, they're in Edinburgh Castle. And another key aspect of societies that were relatively stable when the economies weren't growing and people tended to have fixed resources and fixed incomes, not only was it a fight to defend your interests, but often things did become very political. Access to resources were ultimately political. Who controlled land, for example? And this was often tied as well to a culture of status, aristocracy, for example. We know there were also military elites, and they also had very much a culture of honor, of pride, and the classic thing in Western Europe, of course, was the culture of the duel, where someone was perceived an insult to their honor, they might challenge someone to fight in a duel. And depending on the country, the rules worked differently. The Russians had a particularly brutal model of duels where they kept shooting until, or fighting with swords until someone was wounded. So this was the quintessential conflict trap that once it was entered into, mutual pride, dignity demanded that the conflict continued until someone was hurt, typically died of wounds. The most famous poet in Russian history, Russian literature, Pushkin, had a very famous poem, Onegin. This is really about this, about how one aristocrat ends up in a fight, effectively to the death, with his best friend. And one of the most surreal aspects of this is that Pushkin wrote this very famous epic poem, and it's been rendered into film and opera, for example. And yet Pushkin himself, despite actually writing this, also died in a duel. So one can understand the structure of these things and actually also succumb to it yourself and find it inescapable. And so there is a really important point here that sometimes there are underlying structural circumstances where conflict is inevitable. And this is what game theory examines when we talk about the prisoner's dilemma, for example, which I won't get into the detail of, but which applies very well to a range of businesses, for example, where there is an oligopoly, two major players, for example, or seven, maybe it can be a few more, but very often two players, who find themselves in a constant dilemma of whether they surreptitiously cooperate to price fix, or do they end up in mutually costly discount price wars, for example, which of course are very good for the consumers. So there are some circumstances where the underlying structural interests, the dynamics, make it much more likely that the other party will play a distributive game. They will be self-centered. It won't be win-win. A typical kind of one-shot deal where you're not going to deal with these people again, you should expect to get ripped off. Any kind of end game can get really ugly. If they don't have to deal with you again, and if their reputation is not at stake, expect to get ripped off. And so you have to plan to protect yourself. You have to fight hard in a distributive sense there. Yeah, this is why we talk about tourist traps. You know, tourists get ripped off all the time for the simple reason that the people selling know that they're not locals, know that they probably don't know anybody else locally, and so their reputation isn't going to be damaged because effectively you're not in a position to influence their reputation. So don't be surprised if they rip you off. This is where electronic digital platforms on things like hotel bookings and restaurant bookings and whatnot have helped to overcome these kind of informational problems, where anyone can damage the reputation of someone else through a critical review, for example. Still expect to get ripped off in the street, you know, by the vendor selling, you know, bottles of water on a hot day, for example, and outside the tourist attraction, or someone selling T-shirts or whatever in the street. But at least the restaurant or the hotel or whatever is much less likely to give you lousy service because I think you're not able to damage their reputation than was the case in the past, because of course you can write a critical review. But there are still plenty of circumstances where structurally the dominant strategy is, and this is a classic game theory notion, is to be selfish and take advantage of the other party and to be focused in purely distributive terms. So avoid naive optimism. Be alert to the risks of being ripped off. Now, critical to handling any negotiation situation well is to know your alternatives. And in the practice and theory and teaching of negotiation, we often talk about a BATNA, okay, and to know your BATNA. And a BATNA stands for your best alternative to negotiated agreement. So if you walk away, or if the negotiation fails, what are your alternatives, okay? So to do well in any circumstance, to avoid making a hasty decision that's not in your best interests, always be alert to your alternatives. If you can, be cultivating alternatives if the negotiation drags out over time. And this is a strategy sometimes in business, to keep rivals talking even though you're not serious about committing, precisely to have them so distracted from other potential opportunities out there, okay? They may be developing a better alternative while keeping you talking and have you thinking that you're about to have some kind of new strategic partnership, for example. Meanwhile, you're not actually developing your alternative. So if you're aware of your alternatives, this will give you more confidence in negotiation. If you have alternatives, and if you don't have alternatives, then it will make you very focused on the need to get a deal. However, there's a really important thing to know here. Life, to some degree, is a confidence trick. If you are desperate, there is a danger you will look desperate, and if you look desperate, you will be taken advantage of. So especially when your circumstances are dire, difficult, you really need a negotiated outcome, the challenge is to stay calm, to look like you've got alternatives, to get the best possible deal. Because just because you need a deal, even a bad deal, of course, doesn't mean that you should give up on trying to get a better deal out of the process. So act like you do have alternatives, okay? Also be alert to the fact that salespeople, for example, others, will often engage in subtle or unsubtle attempts to weaken your own confidence in your alternatives. And they can do this several ways. They can have you doubt your own calculus about your own interests. A salesperson may say, yes, well, it's a good product, but are you really sure that's what you need? You really sure it's right for you? That product is particularly good for people who blah, 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 but my sense of what you really need is blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what they're actually doing is messing with your own sense of what your needs are. And if they do that, then they can insert a story or a narrative into a redescription of your particular interests and needs, which suits their interests. Okay? A broader thing is just simply to question whether someone really has done their homework, done their research. If you look pretty confident that an alternative is a promising one, to just simply sow the seeds of doubt. To even simple things like, so you do know about the problems they had last year. I think some of the people have moved on. It was very messy, but and just give the sense that the other party is disorganized, that there was some issue, and you won't know because very often it's exaggerated, and it will just work away in your brain, slowly undermining your self-confidence that you've completely done your homework, that you've really researched all around the issues, and you're confident in the relative attractiveness of different offers. Now, as I've said, avoid showing weakness, but also I want to urge you to avoid showing hubris. And this is a pretty confronting image, even more so when I tell you what it is. This was actually used to execute, to lock the head off, a guy called Struensee, who was a liberal reformer several hundred years ago in Denmark. He was a lowly born chap. He was the son of a minister, a brilliant individual who rose to a very senior role in public life as advisor to the king, who had mental health issues. And he was effectively de facto the reformist ruler of the Kingdom of Denmark. But it kind of went to his head, and then he lost his head, quite literally. He became a little bit too confident, I was going to say cocky, and he apparently became rather intimate with the Queen, which was a bridge too far. Well and truly, aristocrats were absolutely mortified, and he was threatening aristocratic interests. And if he'd just stayed a little more modest, he could have continued to have a very significant influence, power. But he provoked rivals, and it didn't end well for him. Okay, that, by the way, is exhibited in the National Museum in Denmark. So a powerful warning against hubris. So I think it's meaningful to hear. Just think about how we actually communicate in negotiations. We're often talking grand terms or theoretical terms, or people throw themselves into game theoretical studies and whatnot. But then overlook some of the really basic things. In the end, a negotiation is typically a communications act. It's a dialogue, okay? And if you approach it like a battle, with the equivalent of daggers drawn or pistols cocked, ready to do each other in, then maybe in a distributive sense, that's not bad, but so much of potential negotiations is integrative. It's growing the pie. So even if your goals are purely distributive, to gain at the other person's expense, I'd suggest that you should approach it, more like a seduction. You want to be more of a charmer than a crazy brave warrior, because an aggressive approach is just simply going to make people defensive. Now, you don't want to be a bit creepy and over the top and acting like someone's best friend when you're obviously not and you've got conflicting interests, but try to charm them rather than to terrorize them. There is a time to be tough, particularly if they're conducting themselves in a very bad way, but to show a little bit of both. It can be very positive, it can be very nice, but if you cross a line, then I'll be super tough on you. Then that's a pretty good demeanor posture, I think, to have in most negotiation situations. So, how do you make warm connections with people? First of all, use people's names. That's just really elementary, psychologically wise. People like to hear their own name, okay? Also, a good thing to do is to signal what you're about to say, to lead in, to get people to actually to listen to what you say, having told them roughly what it's going to be about. You know, my underlying interests on this one, or what I don't understand here, or perhaps you can help me to clarify these issues, for example. And you can be even more reserved and more polite. And the really basic thing, may I ask a question? That they will lean in. They will get attention. May I ask a question? Yes, of course. Okay. You've shown respect to the other party. It gets attention. It certainly eases tension. And it slows down the cut and thrust, that you're dialing back on the conflict, as it were. And another fundamental thing is to always avoid the temptation to preface any remarks you make by signaling disagreement. You say, oh, nonsense, oh, I disagree, oh, come on, or anything like that. As soon as you say that, as soon as you explicitly disagree with someone, they're probably going to stop listening at what you're going to say afterwards. One trick you can use from time to time is to sort of agree in order to disagree, to get them engaged with the logic of what they're saying. They say, okay, maybe one good way to do this is to repeat the fundamental essence or the fundamental logic of their argument, and that way you can actually confirm the logic of their argument. So am I right in understanding that your take on this or your position on this is dun, 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 okay? You say, okay, I see your perspective, but following that or in line with that, how do you make sense of dun, 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 dun? Okay, so you've engaged them on their terms, and then you draw them out to show the logical inconsistencies, for example, of their own position. And it's always a good thing anyway to confirm understanding of the other party. And indeed, a very good practice is, if you have to have a face-to-face meeting, is to follow up with a short email afterwards, just with summary points, to get confirmation of understanding there. A little bit more on communications. Go light on the adjectives. I say avoid needless adjectives here, particularly when you're praising your own stuff. I'm going to make you a really good offer. That's unnecessary, to the point of being silly. From their perspective, of course you're going to say it's a good offer. They have to decide whether it's a good offer or not, okay? They don't want you to be imposing your judgment about their interests. So there always has to be this sense of ownership. Very often you can make a great offer to someone and they'll be very resistant to it, just simply because they don't like to have it imposed on it. Is going to be often counterproductive. You often have to lead people gently to the position, and it's often said that the best way to get people to agree to an idea is to somehow lead them into thinking that they had the idea themselves in the first place. Okay, so one trick to do this is to agree with various things they have said, and then present as a consequence or an implication of what they have said, your proposition. And particularly people who are readily confused might find themselves agreeing to your proposition because you've prefaced it with things that they have said, even though it may not be logically consistent. A smarter person will probably get that, but it's probably often worth a try. Okay. The broader point with praising your own offers and whatnot is that it implies that the other party, if they refuse to accept it, is somehow being unreasonable, and it's just annoying. Okay. All those the usual rules about not insulting the other side apply. I think we get that. One thing that so many professionals do, not just in negotiation situations, but in any kind of service industry situation, is to try and find something in common with the other party so that they can feel some kind of emotional connection with you. And we see a lot of professionals do this. Hairdressers are extraordinarily good at remembering details about people, and hopefully even they can find something in their own experience, or sometimes they will share a story about another client with the details of the particular individual, of course, removed, to find some common element, even if it's not their own common element. The commonality doesn't have to be so much about the other party. Why we respond well to that is we like it when people are attentive to our own particular interests, and when we sense that they are a good listener and they have an interest in our interests, and that they have a good take on it, that they have understood it, that they can repeat, in a sense, the logic of our interests or our concerns or our perceptions. And the best way to do that is to make some connection to themselves or a third party in a way that is quite consistent. Okay, so in terms of actually convincing people to do something, a lot of people, and I'm kind of guilty of this myself sometimes, the kind of the PowerPoint or the keynote approach, okay, is 4 good reasons. Have I got 4 fingers? Yep. 4 good reasons why you should agree to what I'm about to say. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you look really rikutsboy, really shitskoy, okay, to use the Japanese. You look like a rikutsboy, like a reason freak. You look like a smart ass, okay? People don't want to be read the equivalent of a kind of a charge sheet, but when you're up in court, or presented with all this supposedly this kind of knockout lawyerly account of why you should sign on the dotted line. So don't dilute your argument by having too many points to support your case. Give people one good reason. One good reason is much more convincing than 4 or 5 reasons. By definition, when you give people 4 reasons, each of the reasons in themselves actually looks rather weaker. Okay? For example, if you're not buying a very expensive present for someone and you give them 2 small presents rather than 1, it often looks like you were a bit of a cheapo with the first one and you felt guilty and you bought a second one. Okay? Which maybe is okay. It's a bit of a package. But one really good thing often, particularly when the value can't be discerned, if you're giving an antique, for example, one good antique is a better thing to give than a few things that look like you browse the flea market, for example. So one good reason to do something, and if that reason is not accepted, then give them another one. So have the list of reasons, okay? It may add up to 4 good reasons for doing it, but better to deliver them one at a time. As a good way of taking the conflict out of any kind of negotiation, trying to put the emotion aside and be focused on the issues, offer a commentary on your own feelings in response to their positions. If you find that their approach is quite aggressive, for example, you say, "Look, it's probably just me. I'm sure you don't intend this, but I feel that you're being a little bit aggressive in that, or I sense a certain aggressiveness from you right now." And if you communicate in those terms, then very often they will apologize. "Oh, no, sorry, I don't mean to come on too strong. I don't mean to be aggressive." And so you've actually flipped them. So rather than attacking you, they're actually now apologizing. So they've got something to make up for. So to narrate your own feelings is a good way to protect your own interests, being respectful. You can be self-deprecatory as well. you can say, look, I'm probably just misunderstanding this, or I probably missed something. I'm sure the fault's with me. I didn't get it, or I'm sure you don't mean to say, when you know full well that they actually do, for example. Okay, but it gives an impression of openness and self-awareness, and therefore it also makes it a lot easier to be honest about your feelings. Finally, a critical thing, sometimes, in fact, very often, no deal is the best deal. Okay? Don't let time constraints or last minute demands cause you to agree to a bad deal. You know, there are times in the pub at night when you better just go home and go home alone. Okay? So, yeah, just don't for the sake of having something to show for the night out or the negotiation or the trip to the shops, you agree to something at the last minute, just because otherwise it may have felt like a waste of time. Walking away with no deal actually can be a very satisfying, self-affirming moment, where you say, no, I'm really in control of my own destiny here. I am exercising judgment. And have a portfolio approach. There will be some days that will be very productive days. There will some days that won't be. There will some days you will shop and you'll find nothing to buy. The days when you don't find things to buy, you go home, you've got money in your pocket, you've checked the market, and you have been true to your own interests and tastes and not succumb to the manipulation, the sales pressures of other people, for example. Okay? So have a portfolio approach to life. Some days will be good deal days, some days will be no deal days, and the no deal days will be an affirmation of your self-determination and your wisdom.